DHG here doing my review for The Lies of P. P stands for something that you'll figure out eventually when playing through the game. They make it pretty apparent. If you've never listened to one of my reviews before, when I play through these games, I jot down things that I think are pluses, things that I think are minuses, and things that fall somewhere in between. They're a bit subjective. Okay, the first thing. The story of morality and evil eugenics' quest for evolution was pretty good. They also embark on people trying to undertake eternal life, and it has somewhat of a transhumanist feel, like the metaphor for the entire game with puppets and P. Now, I'm not going to dive down that rabbit hole because that's not the purpose of this review, so I'm going to move on to the next plus. Fantastic Bloodborne meets steampunk aesthetic. Now you can see in the background there the different types of buildings. They're all very Victorian style looking. This is straight from the Bloodborne playbook, which I heard about and which was why I started playing this game to begin with, because I heard Bloodborne was a major inspiration. That's not the only thing they took from Bloodborne. But they also do the whole steampunk type feel with electronics and they call them puppets, but they're more like automatronics, like the Five Nights at Freddy's type things. They have more of that creepy feel to them. Map menu lets you know where the objectives are. Now, map is a misnomer. There is no map in this game. But you can see this is somewhat similar to the bonfire layout that you have in the Soul series. If you take a look at the lower left and you see the hotel crop with the two symbols beside it, that lets you know that there are two objectives there, either main objectives or sub-objectives, it doesn't matter. And you look at the Roman numeral 8, you'll see that little blue diamond. Now it will show you a specific location, and it won't say exactly what it is, but it'll let you know that something's there. That was a very nice addition that I think Elden Ring had, but I know before that, like Dark Souls 3, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, they didn't have that option in the game. You just kind of had to remember what was where. I wouldn't mind seeing more of that. Exploration is fun. Just like all the other Souls-like games, or at least most of the ones that I played, with the exception of maybe one or two that I didn't care for. The exploration adds another layer of depth. Aside from the combat, it's just nice to explore these maps and find out where all the different hidden items are, stuff like that. This one is absolutely no different. In fact, I would say this one was almost on par with one of the original Souls games. The weapon modification system was brilliant. Take a look at the different items I have. Now, normally in a Souls game, you have to build your stat loadout, dexterity, strength, whatever it is, with a specific weapon loadout in mind. And once you do that, unless you restat your character, which they let you do in some of the newer games, some of the older games like Demon Souls, I don't think they let you do that. It's been a while though, so I could be wrong. But this one, if you put all your points into, let's say this game's equivalent of strength, or this game's equivalent of dexterity, you can modify each weapon, except for these legendary weapons, like the first one you see on the left there. That one can't be modified. That has its own stats that it's good with. But all these other ones, the top part of the weapon is what gives it its properties, its attacks, anything special about it. The bottom part is the handle. You can swap those out as you see fit so that you can use any weapon with your build. I thought that was brilliant. Some people could say, well, then what's the point of making certain builds? Same point as there was before, but now you can use any type of weapon you want with that build. The game has familiar controls. It didn't try to reinvent the wheel. This is a good thing because they add quite a few new functions onto your normal Souls-like build when it comes to controls and the interface. If you look at the left-hand screen, you'll notice that you have your typical Souls-like belt slots, but you've got two of them. Switching back and forth between the upper belt and the lower belt it's quite confusing in the beginning of the game, but you get used to it. I would say maybe an hour into the game or so, I wasn't screwing up anymore and trying to activate things on my bottom belt, but even near the end of the game, it would still catch me from time to time. But it was nice having the option there instead of just swapping through one gigantic belt that had like 8 or 9 different items you could use in it. If you hold down on the A button, it was kind of similar if in Bloodborne when you pressed on the motion sensor, that big square thing that was in the middle of the controller, it added like another large inventory slot or something that had 5 or 6 things in it. That's here too. But another function they added was I think it's called the Legion arm in this game. It's his robotic arm that has several different functions. I think I unlocked about 9 or 10 Legion arms, only 3 of which I ended up using. But in terms of your basic combat, strong attacks, weak attacks, all that, building up the power attacks and combos, they didn't really change anything much here. Some weapons do have a trick weapon function that Bloodborne had, but there's not many of them. This was one of the ones that did have them. Superb musical score. Now, the Souls games have generally had good music across the board, if they were made by From Software. But some of the games that weren't made by From Software that were in the Souls-like series, let's say Mortal Shell, for instance, or Code Vein, didn't really have good music, but this game has extraordinarily good music with it. Think on the level of what I would say were two of the Souls-like game's best moments when it comes to the music. Demon Souls, when you meet Maiden Astria, which is the last boss in the Valley of Defilement, from the original Demon Souls game. The Demon Souls from Bluepoint Software, the remake for PlayStation 5, didn't really have the same type of music. It didn't sound as good. That and the final boss that you fight, or one of the final bosses, I think his name was Hendrik from Bloodborne. Fantastic music. Throughout this game, you'll just notice one good musical score after another, and you can also go around and collect records which have said music on them, which makes it more interesting. One of the NPCs in the game, I'm not going to give away which one, but there was a very effective moment they had with this NPC at the end of the game. Very, very good, top-notch, very good storytelling. Now I'm going to get into some of the things that aren't really here or there. They're entirely subjective, which some things I might like, some things you might not. The game had very linear maps. You go from one stargazer to the next, and eventually you complete the game. There wasn't really a lot of branching off paths. Like, this is set up a lot more like the original Demon Souls game, where you go from one... I can't remember what they called the bonfires in that game, but you go from one point to the next. There's not really a lot of opportunity to get lost or go to a harder area which you're not supposed to access until later. They didn't add that until the second game, Dark Souls. This is fairly linear. You go from one part to the next as the game wants you to go. There's only one progression that you can go through. I thought that was good, but other people might not like that, because a lot of people did like the interconnected world that the Souls games had, or some of them had. Combat can feel unwieldy. Yeah, and we got everyone's favorite boss on the screen right there. He's actually a sub-boss. You could just walk right past him, but I felt compelled to beat him. The combat feels unwieldy for a couple reasons, and I'll get into those later. Those are in the minus section, so to speak. But the combat feels like it could have been tightened up quite a lot more. Dodging. Dodging can be a bit of a mess. Right here, you actually see some quite of effective dodging. But when you fight some of the bigger bosses, like, let's say the Mad Clown King, or... what was the guy's name? The King of Puppets. He was quite bad. A lot of these bosses have very large area of effect attack, but a lot of them will just do a generally wide sweeping area. And then you have the Fury attacks on top of it. Those are this game's version of unblockable attacks. The only way that you can not take damage from them is by a perfect block, which is very hard to do, but I'll get into that later. The dodging was kind of iffy. You ended up eating damage in a lot of instances where you could have sworn you were out of the way. The game has no co-op. This is strictly a single-player game. But you can see here, there's Someone with some almost whitish hair wandering around. That's a specter that you can summon to help with boss fights. Kind of let's just say taking the place of a co-op character. I thought that was a nice addition. Another Souls-like game did that recently too, which was Wulong Fallen Dynasty. I didn't care for that game, but it had a similar function. This one worked out quite well. Whether you think no co-op's a good thing or not, that's up to you. I would have liked to have seen co-op, but the experience was good as it was. Now we're getting into the negatives. The entirety of the game's mechanics can be overwhelming. It's got a very steep learning curve to it. They don't throw everything at you at once though, but in the beginning you're going to be playing a bit catch up. You're going to be familiar with the stat allocation, which is just like a Souls game, but then they throw this in here, which you'll see in the still frame. This is, they call it the P organ. I don't remember what it stands for. Probably something to do with the character's name. But it levels you up in ways that the Souls games would have used with items. Like in the Souls games, to get more Estus flask usage, you needed to collect a certain item. This, you just collect quartz that can be bought, dropped from fallen enemies, or otherwise. And then you go back here and you allocate where you want to use those different points. I wasn't quite fond of this system at first, but I ended up liking it in the end. The only problem I do have with it is I was a little turned off by it at first. Some players might just turn off the game, which is never a good thing. But once you get to know the systems of the game with the upgrades and swapping out the different handles and how you can pretty much use any type of weapon with any build that you want, the game becomes very user-friendly, but it doesn't appear that way at first. That's my problem with it. It appears not to be user-friendly when it is. Enemy attacks flail about chaotically, making perfect blocking damn hard. I sort of touched upon that earlier when I was getting into my combat can be unwieldy, but I pretty much gave up blocking, or trying to do the perfect blocks in this game, which, if you do a perfect block in this game, it gives the enemy stagger damage. They accumulate enough stagger damage, then you can whip out a special attack which does a lot of damage. It's very useful. Problem is, from what I've read and pretty much gathered on my own, the perfect block window is very small in this game, and trying to figure out when the enemy is actually going to unlaunch or launch an attack on you is quite difficult, especially from the earliest stages of the game when a lot of the puppets will go start swinging up their attack or whatever. They'll raise their arm, and it seems like 5 years later they finally decide to let it down and you just get hit with something. I couldn't get used to the blocking in this game, and I beat Sekiro Shadows Die twice. Once, and I almost beat it a second time, but then I just grew disinterested. So it's not like I have a problem with blocking. It was just how this game does it. Another negative. Enemies seem to have infinite stamina. Now, the boss that's on screen isn't really one of those enemies, but he still can get quite ridiculous in the just relentless attacks that he lets out. This one is quite staggerable. There's a lot of enemies in this game, especially like the King of Puppets. You're not going to stagger them. And not very often anyway. And they just keep attack. It's unlike the Souls games where you can have an enemy let off like a 6-hit combo or something, but then they take a minute to recharge. In this, they don't. They just go straight into another combo. It's a bit ridiculous. So I mentioned this game's version of, you've seen it right there. When the enemy glows red, that means a fury attack, which means you can't block it. Or you have to do a perfect parry to take no damage and then do stagger damage on them. It's very hard to do. But if you try to dodge out of the way, most of the time you're going to eat the damage. Pretty much most of the time. This guy, you can dodge his attacks, but a lot of the larger bosses like King of Puppets, the Mad Clown, you're just going to eat the damage. Dodging is not effective on them whatsoever. So overall, sum of all things considered, I had my frustrations with the games. There was some areas that they could have been tighter, especially within the combat. But when it comes to the overall feel of the world, the game's aesthetic, what kind of art form they pushed, It was all very good, very convincing. You could tell that it was inspired by Bloodborne and was a very interesting story with some very effective moments with the NPCs that you get involved with. Especially the, I'm not going to say his real name, spoiler, but the guy, let's just call him the Riddler. And then the NPC that levels you up primarily had a very good storyline too. I would say much more compelling than a lot of the Souls games even dared to touch on. So, this game got a good rating.